I'm Stephen Foskett, the organizer of Tech Field Day, and we're here in San Francisco at Intel Cloud Day. We are learning about some of Intel's new announcements and products and technologies, and I've convened a panel of experts here on networking to talk about some of the networking aspects of what was announced today. So let's go around and introduce ourselves.
My name is John Welsh. I'm a solutions architect. You can find me online on Twitter at Sample5, and my blog's at sample5.com.
Ryan Booth, blog at blog.movingonesandzeros.net, Twitter at that1guy_15.
I'm Tom Hollingsworth. I'm a networking blogger and speaker. You can find me on Twitter as @networkingnerd, and you can find my blog at networkingnerd.net.
I'm Drew Conway Murray. I'm content director at Packet Pushers. I'm on Twitter at Drew_CM, and you can find my blog at packetpushers.net.
Hi, I'm Matt Oswalt, and I blog at keepingitclassless.net and on Twitter at Mearden.
Excellent. Well, one of the big platform innovations that Intel talked about today was TPM 2.0, the Trusted Platform Module, which is one of the core components of server-side security. But of course, Intel has a lot of other security functions and security features. Probably one of the best known among nerds like us are the crypto accelerators built into the chips. Very, very useful. Where does Intel fit in this bigger picture of the security landscape?
Yeah, for me, one of the things today they were talking about is their centralized firewall controller or security controller, where it seems to be they're making a play against the other vendors out there in this space to try to get their hands into what's going on there. So if you got your distributed firewalls, centralized policy management, those various tools that they're bringing to the table, it didn't seem like it was too far off what anybody else is doing out there. Some of the concerns like that for me, I know we've talked about it as well, is you got a central controller, got a central point of failure, or you have one spot to break before you can penetrate the security level. I'm a little nervous, or I want to know more about how you better manage that.
I think that having a centralized controller to keep track of your firewall policy is not necessarily a bad thing, because those firewalls, kind of like an open flow leaf switch, in the event that something happens to the controller, maybe it gets compromised and things happen, but if that thing breaks because someone busts it with a DDoS, the firewalls are still going to operate on last known good config. So I think that it's really good from a perspective of being able to collect analytics to know we're seeing attacks here, or we need to redeploy to save this part of the network from an incursion.
But it breaks in a secure, keep applying these rules type configuration, not in terms of, hey, the doors are open, everybody, come on in. Yeah, that would be not so good.
And I can understand, you want your firewalls as close to your VMs now, and you want those rules to be able to shift with it. If I got to move workload from one area to another, I don't want to be moving physical firewalls around. So it's a necessity. Kind of one of my things with that as well, though, is, okay, now I got an intruder is trying to get into the infrastructure. Instead of having to break through layer upon layer upon layer, they now just have to infiltrate the security controller, do what they need to do from there, and then flow through the rest, unless you segregate those out.
So I don't think it necessarily means that these other layers are gone. I mean, when you're deploying this security layer in your virtual environment, that doesn't mean that the stuff that is in your physical environment goes away. I mean, you still have north-south protection. It's just now you've got this firewall, as they were saying, east-west protection between the VMs. I don't think it's necessarily meant to keep somebody from the outside world from coming into your environment and just waltzing onto your network without having anything to stop them.
That's a good point. That's
a lot like a door lock. It's going to keep out the casual intruders, but someone who's determined to get into your house is still going to be able to get there. And I think that the way that policy has had to shift recently to protect the VMs on a small mobile basis is really affecting this for people, because like you said, if I move a firewall or I have to move a section of my data center, it's unprotected during that move.
Right.
And once it gets where it's supposed to be, who knows what broke? It could take days. I have friends in the security community that they stick log rules on their firewall And they audit them, and they're like, well, that rule's been in there for 6 years, and it's never triggered a hit once. So, I mean, that's what we're trying to solve here, is we're trying to solve the red light fatigue, if you will, where everyone looks at the rule set and goes, there's no way that I'm going to be able to figure out what these are doing.
Yeah, the move to a centralized point of administration doesn't inherently, make us riskier or less secure. I think, our bespoke changes to firewalls that don't match each other and poorly updated applications have done a good job of that thus far. I think the key here is to focus on the fact that this measure is closer and closer to the app. The closer you are to the app, the more context you have. I mean, VMware talks about this all the time with their Goldilocks zone stuff. And they're right. The closer you are to the app, the more context you have. But you have to find that middle ground where you have the controls you need from the basically the same tooling that you're used to. You want to be able to not alienate those people, but you also want to get that context that you haven't had before. You want to stop treating your own hypervisors like a black box. I think that's pretty silly.
Well, and then just one more thing to add to it. I think that from the and this isn't still a released product yet with Intel. So I mean, say that I can't imagine that they would release it and not have the option to have some sort of high availability. So if one of the boxes cratered, you still have another control box that can take over those control functions, even though your firewalls on their own would continue to function.
But do we need to have, just thinking about all of the orchestration pieces that are out there as we talk about software-defined networking or software-defined data center or whatever, and OpenStack and all that, do we need to actually separate out security as its own sort of internal function? Are we getting back to like creating individual silos inside this great, software-defined whatever we've got? Or is that something that can live more natively in an OpenStack or an Open Daylight or whatever your controller is?
Oh, I'm sure OpenStack will create a project for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do like seeing, they mentioned it, they didn't mention any specific partners, but they do have the integration, just like VMware, the other players, where they can integrate with the various firewalls, IPS, IDSs, things like that, to be able to centralize all that. And for me, it's always been that whole, the whole tier is in like a ball, and you shift it from one area to the other. Firewall should be right there with it.
Yeah, I think from like a configuration policy perspective, it's useful to have at least some sort of dedicated resource that you can at least give me like, an API that I can write to. But from like a visibility perspective, and like, I don't know if you want to do like automated pen testing to validate your configs, I think that's something that we could look into as an industry. And that kind of information is definitely useful to not just security-minded folks, but even folks that maybe are less security-minded. Those kind of dashboards are really useful to see sort of side-by-side and correlate with other data, like performance data, right? You can correlate those kind of things at the same time.
One thing that John mentioned that I'm kind of curious about, going back to a lot of the discussion we've had around infrastructure kind of as a utility versus being something custom, bespoke, artisanal, what have you. A lot of what we're trying to do with these technologies is not necessarily securing devices. We're trying to secure applications. And how do you feel that security should treat the application going forward? One of the thoughts that I've had around that is instead of having a table that says, well, here are all the ports that you need to open up on the firewall for my thing to work, doing something more along the lines of policy where the security infrastructure interrogates the application and says, what do you need to work with? And then it compares it against a list that says, these are all the things that you say you need, and if these two things don't match, then we need to reconcile that. I think that would actually lead to a lot more security from an application perspective because it prevents backdoor entry through ports that are unknown and things like that. And it also prevents that fatigue of 9,000 firewall rules for an Oracle database to work. What do you guys think about that?
But then we're going to have to understand and know our applications.
So I've actually been on this before. I think this is one of the biggest reasons why an organization might adopt more of an approach of leveraging existing open source software, contributing back to that model, and using those tools because that security landscape is a known thing, right? These projects are not. If you're talking about a piece of software that your enterprise has developed in house, right? You have to own all of that, or you should anyway. I'm not saying they do, but you should own all of that. Whereas, let's say you want to deploy something like MySQL database with an application on top of that, WordPress. I'll just use that as an example. There are known attack vectors there, and those things are shared amongst the community. So it's not just the open source code, but it's also like this application is a known design. We know how this works, and the security model for that can be shared as well. So I think that's another benefit.
Yeah, essentially having templates that are ready made.
Yeah, exactly.
For when
and actually, we've seen this at previous network field days with Alcatel-Lucent guys.
Networks.
Nuage, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll say, here's the WordPress policy. You just this is a WordPress site. I want to apply this policy because they know what ports are going to be used between the two tiers and all of that.
But
I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Cisco's doing the same thing with ACI. VMware's trying to do that with NSX and Congress.
Yep.
So we're shifting to that policy model. But I worry that we've had templates available forever. It's like when you go into an old firewall and it's like, well, this is the fix-up protocol for SIP or something. It's like, well, SIP worked like that in 2004. It doesn't work like that now. And I'm worried that if you rely on a template methodology, you're obscuring so much of it that if something breaks, you're back in the same boat because you don't know what broke. And I think that's why it has to be a two-way street. For years, the network team has scrambled to fix things, and the application team has just said more, more, more. And I think it's time for the network to start asking the applications more what.
But to get to that point, you have to change the way you write applications.
The applications need to change, and the infrastructure folks need to get on board with how those applications are designed. There needs to be, it's a two-way street. You can't have it both ways.
Right.
So is Intel the right place to launch yet another open source venue for an security controller? Are they the right people to push it? I know why they're pushing it, because if they're getting behind network functions virtualization, which is good for them for selling more Xeon chips, sure, they want to make it easier for people to consume, but are they the right people to do it? Are they going to get traction?
I think they stand a better chance than anybody else because they're kind of a neutral party. I mean, obviously, Intel Security has a huge market segment, but I mean, compared to houses that run Checkpoint or Cisco or Juniper, if one of those companies tries to come out with an open source security model, you immediately have problems with the other side of that argument. It's like, well, Juniper's SRX is now open source and allows us to do that, and the Cisco guys will look at it and go, I don't want to run that.
That's actually a really good question, though. Is Intel the right company to do this? And I guess a corollary to that question is, why is Intel doing this? So if you wonder if Intel's the right company to do this, I think I have an answer. And I think that would be because they announced a 22-core server CPU today.
Yeah.
And one of my questions all day long has been, what are you going to do with all those cores? It's a lot of cores, especially if you've got a dual socket server. Of course, not every, Xeon E5 is going to have 22 cores. But if you've got a dual socket 22-core server, let's find some workloads.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. If I'm, a Palo Alto or a Checkpoint or whatever, it's yet more pressure from Intel that I'm giving up this hardware sale part of my business because I have to virtualize it now, and Intel will happily take that business from me and run it as software. And so they've got their own motivation for doing this. It's not just a gift to the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, it seems like they've had their footprint for a long time. That's kind of obvious, and they're just starting to add more things to that list. We're already in. It's not like we need to get in. We're just going to leverage that footprint to do more interesting things.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you guys for this discussion. You'll find many more discussions like this on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/techfieldday, including other networking roundtables from here at Intel Cloud Day.